Hell no. To the no, no, no. Yeah, to the no. Hell to the no.
2020 it's a year where I think we should all be able to just write it off on our taxes. Like, you know what? Hey, what'd you do for 2020? I survived it. You know what? Write it off. Write it off. And honestly, just because of how long this year felt, it was a surprise how many bad books I read this year. And honestly, some of them varied from, you know what? I'm going to wait for the trade for this, because one or two decisions it's made, along with it just being kind of flat, says I don't really want to read it all the way through right now, month to month. I'd rather just get it all out at once. Others were horrible disappointments. Some were utterly forgettable, which I think is a major crime in itself. A book should never be, actually, nothing you should ever consume in terms of media, or let alone your fandom, should feel forgettable, alright? Because there should at least be a glorious train wreck, alright? And that's what these books are in some ways. They sort of, none of these are forgettable for the most part, but they were just books that left a taste in my mouth and didn't really fill me with the same sort of joy and optimism for said fandom as it should have. And some of these won't be surprising in terms of the larger fandom. Some may surprise you. Some aren't as bad. Some may be the former, which is, hey, I'm just going to wait for the trade. But, yeah, 2020 has been that year. And there's even worse things coming in the future, apparently. Future State. Oh, the price alone keeps me out of Future State. But anyway, let's get into this. Let's start with the first one, Far Sector. So, considering that Joe Mulane is going to be in DC's Future State Justice League book, I don't really quite feel I need to read this now. But the reason I stopped reading it was because, as creative as it is, and as good as the book looks, the book does look amazing, there was really just one page that got me. One page that said, I don't really care to read this. And Far Sector has the premise of a new Green Lantern from Earth who is stuck on this planet at the far end of the universe, which has the city Enduring has about 200 billion people in it, and she's solving a crime which leads to other stuff. There's a lot of really smart stuff in Far Sector, but it's a bit of a slow burn. And I'm not saying it's an SJW book. I don't think it is. I really don't think it is. I think it has some of those leanings, but the problem is that Joe goes through a lot, and I think it's an attempt to sort of define the quote-unquote black experience, which I don't think any book is qualified to tell. It's not fair. There is no definitive black experience. Let's be clear. There's no definitive any insert race here experience. No one lives a set life solely based on the color of their skin. And the book doesn't really try to commit to that. I get the book is trying to tell something about where Joe's been and what Joe's had to deal with, but also at the same time it feels like it's trying to speak for everyone. And to the book's credit, that isn't everywhere. It was really just one flashback, and I can kind of see how some of this does happen. But the more interesting stuff in terms of Joe's flashback was really just, say, where her and her father were when 9/11 happened, and her issues with and her time on the police force. I felt that alone would have been a great story. What got me to really just say, like, you know what, I don't need to read this book month to month, which led to me just forgetting about it, was this page here. So, the Guardian here, who is kind of coded to be black, which is, I think, a bit weird because all the Guardians are blue, but that's really not the case with it. It's just, I think, the lighting and the coloring. But whatever. So this ring here, where every other ring is, the Green Lantern ring is about willpower in the face of fear. This ring is about willpower from living in fear. So, yes, this ring is designed for the willpower exclusive to a group of people. This ring follows a trope that I've actually come across and I really hate it, where my oppression is a superpower. Whether this is what the writer intends to or not is sort of irrelevant. I just don't like this. I just don't like this. Because your ancestors have been enslaved, and because it's been social unrest, and this is the civil rights era, because it's been hard for your skin color in one country. It's actually mostly the West, irrelevant, because racism, you have a superpower. All right, and I just don't like this. I don't like that idea. It turns me off just about any book I'm reading. And I just like, you know what? I'm going to take a break from this book and reading it again, like the entirety again. I do appreciate again this book. I appreciate this character. Will she be great in Justice League for I think it's just 2 issues that run is going to go? Who knows? But yeah, so I expect I'll pick this up in trade, and that one moment won't be enough to keep me from reading or enjoying it. I highly doubt it will. Next is Doctor Who Timelord Victorious. So the Timelord Victorious is this weird sort of initiative / imprint / we don't really quite know thing that Doctor Who is doing, where it's a series of stories centered around the 8th, 9th, and 10th Doctor, and apparently the 4th Doctor. So some really popular Doctors, and apparently the 13th Doctor shows up now and then. And to me, the fact that this idea is going to spam comics, audios, novels, to me that's a really cool idea. And we've never actually had that before. Like, for example, the Time War doesn't really eclipse all of it. There was no real plan to tell a Time War story. It's really just, hey, the War Doctor is here with the story. My problem with this first story here, this 10th Doctor story, is as hilarious as the first couple of pages are, which is the Dalek just following the Doctor around, saying like, hey, you're going to help us from this thing called the Horde. The Horn. It's just, it doesn't feel like it's important, and I get the premise of Timelord Victorious. Like, look, everything here isn't mandatory reading. Like, look, you read or listen, you pick up whichever story you want. But to me, the first story should have been, like, from either of these mediums, the first comic of Timelord Victorious should have been amazing, or at least had a really great premise to show up. Same thing with the audio, same thing with the novels. That first one has to be what gets people in. The premise is interesting, but there are people who will spend their money on every bit of it. Same way that for comic books, people will spend every cent they have for the tie-ins for stories. So yeah, you didn't get me excited about this. Nothing about Timelord Victorious excites me. This story is just boring. Both issues of it. The 13th Doctor might be at her best here, which is sad because she doesn't really do anything. And yeah, the 10th Doctor's in character though. Also, I've never quite enjoyed a Doctor Who comic. I think I've read at least 5, and none of them have felt important to me. And I think it's just because I like hearing the Doctor. But at the same time, I just finished reading the Day of the Doctor novel, and that novel's great, by the way. Like, oh, this is great. That novel's great. Well, I'll have to talk about it at some point, but not here. And it just feels like the premise isn't there. And speaking of a story where the premise isn't there, let's talk about Legend of Korra, Ruins of an Empire. So, yeah, Legend of Korra has this problem where it introduces a really cool concept, really cool idea, and then doesn't do anything with it. And that's true. I think that should be something both sides of the Legend of Korra fandom can agree. Whether the people that love Legend of Korra, the people that hate Legend of Korra, the people that keep comparing to ATLA, which is, I think, in some parts valid, in some parts not valid. But yeah, so the premise here is Kuvira has her trial set, and at the same time, one of her followers, along with some of her forces, have taken residence in Toph's old hometown and is trying to be democratically elected in the Earth Kingdom's first democratic election. So this story should be a really cool idea in introducing younger people to the concept of democracy, elections. There's some fun humor about how the other two candidates seem pretty much alike. But the problem is that then it relegates to the idea that Kuvira's follower is just mind-controlling people. And you go like there's a commentary there too, but that sort of takes away from, I think, the real story. There's a scene where Marcus is just, well, let's just cancel the election, to which the Earth King, whose name escapes me right now, says, we can't do that. Okay? And this is before they find out that, hey, he's mind controlling people. It's just like, hey, we don't like this guy. Let's just cancel the election. No, the election has to go through. And that speaks to the principle of democracy, too, where, hey, we may not like this guy, but if he can be democratically elected by the people, then he has to serve. And, yeah, maybe it doesn't quite work, but the real MVP of the story is really Kuvira and Asami. They do a better job of carrying the story, primarily because Asami doesn't trust Kuvira. Kuvira, we get a glimpse into Kuvira's past, which I also felt was great in her relationship with the Beifong family. All of it really great stuff. But everything around it just sort of failed. Now, granted, this makes an improvement over Turf Wars, which was really only great in the beginning because of its world building on same-sex relationships. This one here just sort of has an accidental good dynamic with Asami and Kuvira, who I think both needed this. But yeah, it wasn't that great. Speaking of something that also wasn't that great, that also was worked on by someone who did a really great series before, Samurai 8. So I love samurais. I love a good manga. I liked most of Naruto. I think we can all have a discussion about where Naruto went at the end of it all. But yeah, when I heard that Kishimoto was doing a series on samurai and seeing what he'd done with the samurai in Naruto, I'm like, okay, cool, let's go. What's the premise? Set in the future, like futuristic, sci-fi samurai. Okay, cool, let's try this. And what we got was a really weird story, which, if you had told me Kishimoto, the man who wrote Naruto, wrote this, I wouldn't believe it, even if you showed me his name written down. Now, it's got some of his trappings in it, some of his hints, namely in the first story, the first introductory story. It pretty much reads the same way that the first story in Naruto works, where Naruto finds out that, hey, Iruka does care about him, finds out truth about himself. The character Hachimaru here, who wants to be a samurai, the only difference is he's pretty much an invalid. So he's confined to this life support machine and spends all of his time playing video games, fighting games, and to the series' credit, that does play a role later in terms of how he's such a good fighter. But everything else is just sort of very convoluted and muddled. So Kishimoto understands Japanese mythology and history, all right, especially when it comes to samurai. I think, to his credit, he does that, and him being Japanese doesn't really mean he would know that as well as he did. I've seen a lot of the connections to it, but the problem with Samurai 8 is it's horribly complicated. So the how samurais fight here, with a key holder, with the use of a princess, with only the fact that certain people can be samurais, not even a nobility thing, the fact that to be a samurai you have to have a princess, the fact that your key holder is actually kept inside your body and you can open your body up to pull your... It's weird, it's confusing, and every time something new was brought up, it was just too much too early. Compare this to how he introduced the chakra in Naruto, where we get just a little bit each time, and all of it builds one after the other. There's a lot happening in Samurai 8 in terms of just the magic system, let alone the characters, which don't really quite endear you to them. So, yeah, Samurai 8 was a huge, major letdown. I regret reading it. Actually, yeah, I kind of do regret reading it, because I paid for the trades. I always read to buy, and especially now that in some places it's getting harder to find this stuff online. My Hero Academia has gotten a lot harder to read, honestly. And speaking of something else that was just total, utter disappointment, let's talk about the rise of Kylo Ren. So, I have tried to really like the sequel trilogy. I don't despise it, to be clear, but I don't really have any fond connection to it, whether it be Rey, Snoke, what it did to Luke, which we've already done a couple videos on that. And what I was hoping would help would be expanded material. So the prequel trilogy, for example, is really helped by its expanded material, whether it be the micro series, TCW, the novels like Labyrinth of Evil, the novel adaptation of Revenge of the Sith, Dark Rendezvous, Shatterpoint, the Dark Horse comics about the Clone Wars. All of this serves to really give us a great product, and there's been some really great stuff under the Disney canon. Kanan Last Padawan, I felt was decent. The Anakin and Obi-Wan comic was fun, and the main Star Wars book is alright, and That's kind of it, but you notice none of that has anything to do with the sequel trilogy. Because none of it seems to be good, and this is sad because this is the perfect opportunity to do that. So Rise of Kylo Ren explains to us what happened after the events of, Luke contemplating killing his nephew for a second, and it all going to pot. And what that story should do is sort of endear us to Kylo Ren. It does not do that. I'm not endeared to Kylo Ren by this story. If anything, I find him more annoying. What really annoyed me with Kylo Ren in just The Force Awakens was like, I'm being pulled by the light and the darkness. I'm like, what's the problem? Talk to me. I don't get that. And even Snoke, like, your helmet's ridiculous. Your grandfather had asthma. Like, super space asthma. Alright? What's your problem? Take it off. And even the reveal at the end with the whole, Last Jedi. I'm like, okay, I get why you don't like Luke. But why'd that have you join a fascistic regime? If anything, you should just, go off somewhere. Tell mom and dad what happened so they can chew him out. None of that is really explained here. Ben Solo comes off as whinier than I think he should be allowed to for someone who should be the victim of, my uncle contemplated killing me, so I left. But how am I the whinier? How am I whining too much? Because he doesn't even talk about that. He really doesn't. He has this weird sort of... It's weird that in this story, he goes to talk to Snoke. And we remember, in Last Jedi, Snoke had already got to him. Snoke had already turned his heart, turned him to darkness. I never get that understanding. The Knights of Ren are a total, complete joke. I don't get them. It turns out, no, Ben Solo did not take a handful of Luke's students to raise the temple. And people are debating whether or not he did blow up the temple. I think he did. I'm totally up for him accidentally blowing up the temple, because that's how it reads in the comic. But some people are saying, oh, Snoke did it. Okay, why? It's just a horrible... I haven't watched The Mandalorian, but due to a certain scene I saw, I now need to watch The Mandalorian. I'm always the last one on these things, but oh my god. Why is it that nothing in terms of the sequel trilogy seems to have any real love for itself? Like Disney's put out, under the whole Disney brand, we've got at least 3 to 4 different Darth Vader comics. And all of those are pretty consistent with Darth Vader, even in the old Legends continuity. Alright? The new stuff with the main Star Wars line, with the stuff which we've just now gotten to a post-Empire Strikes Back continuity, that's fine. Doesn't feel mandatory. Plays around with itself sometimes. But when it comes to Disney's own personal stuff, this sequel trilogy, Disney seems unwilling to plan this out. We have a High Republic story coming out next month. Okay? That story is going to talk about stuff that happened before the events of the prequel series. Like, Yoda's going to be pretty young here. So, why is it that they're willing to go that far back but won't fix this train wreck here? This is why people think, or I think a really good reason why they think, oh, well, the sequel trilogy didn't happen. Okay, congratulations. You've launched one of the biggest fandom failures in history. Alright, this is the epitome of your fandom not serving you well. Because you have every opportunity to flesh this out. Instead, you've created 3 films that have fundamentally divided the Star Wars fanbase. That's it. Okay. So clearly, this is the worst comic of 2020, because I have yet to shut up about this entire thing. I've talked more about this book here, and what it says about the fandom itself, than I have about anything else. Alright? Legend of Korra is a discussion in itself, but it's a pretty tame discussion that most people, I think, agree on. Far Sector, again, that's more on me and how I felt about one page. Is it valid? Is it not? That's a discussion to be had in itself. I still enjoy Far Sector. I just really don't want to add it to my pull list. I'd rather just get it in trades, which I do for other books like Jason Aaron's Avengers and the Fantastic Four. There are some books I just don't want to have to read month to month when I can just get the trade later. Doctor Who Timelord Victorious I felt was just poorly handled. But this story here, is a perfect example of why Disney Star Wars has proven to be a mistake. The Mandalorian can't do everything. It is not the way. Anyway, with that in mind, we're done ranting here. Was that a proper rant? I don't know. So we're going to bring this video to a close here. This was the worst books of 2020. What was the worst thing you read? Do you agree with my list? I didn't realize how few books I'd actually read for this to be my worst list. I need to do a better job, or at the very least, get my dates right, because I probably have missed something here. Leave your thoughts in the comment section. I'll catch you all later. This is Bugger Think Tank signing off. Thanks for watching, and as always, may your fandom serve you well.
Hell no, to the no, no, no.